Good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. You made it to the end of the week. This is BRN AM for Friday, November 1st, 2019. Here are our top stories: the active versus passive debate and the proliferation of exchange-traded funds, and alternative investments. Are they appropriate for America's retirement plans? Last week, we featured 2 episodes, Thursday and Friday, on exchange-traded funds, ETFs, and alternative investments, private equity, hedge funds, and infrastructure. Joining me now to give his reaction, financial advisor and chief community officer for the Money Alignment Academy, George Grombacher. Hi, George. How are you?
Jeff, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Great to see you. Always, seek out your words of wisdom. How was your Halloween?
Had a successful Halloween. We were the Avengers, for lack of a better term. My oldest was Spider-Man, and my youngest was a very contained 3-week America.
Ah, okay. It sounds like a lot of fun and a lot of creativity. I'm sure you got lots of pictures.
Oh, for sure.
So George, I want to get into it with you on 2 topics today. In segment 1, I want to talk about exchange-traded funds. So last week we featured Ryan Saberkel from Direction Investments to kind of lay out for the audience the basics around ETFs, exchange-traded funds. They're bags or boxes of securities, basically stocks, and they usually track an index. Right now, we're looking at close to over $4 trillion in ETFs. So, you're the head of Money Alignment Academy, chief community officer. You're out there talking to plan sponsors, meaning employers, after talking to people. What are your thoughts on ETFs?
Well, I think that certainly they've been well received by everyone. Anytime something new comes along, people just need a little bit of education to figure out what it is, and then they can make an opinion if it's good or it's bad. But I think that adoption has been pretty widely accepted, and once people understand, it's very, very similar to a mutual fund. In fact, a lot of people probably can't tell the difference between the two of them. Then they're excited about the efficiency and obviously the cost structure of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only real difference is kind of how they're structured, but also that they trade like daily as opposed to one at one time overnight. You mentioned education. One of the things that's going on in our industry, and we continue to see this, the shift from active to passive, and I think ETFs have really benefited from that trend. Any thoughts about that? You're out there talking, like I said, to employers with their 401k or 403b plans, but also people. Is there that mindset, the shift from active to passive?
There definitely has been. And you think about all the different information that we ask people to take in. We ask them to understand asset allocation and just how the retirement plans work in general. And that alone is a lot. But then to expect the ordinary investor, the average consumer out there, to understand the difference between active and passive management is a pretty big ask. But it's been going on now for the past 10 years or so. And I think that people understand that the evidence is in, for the most part, that it's awfully tough to beat the market.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a remote chance to actually beat the market personally. But that being said, active managers do bring value, and they just have to outperform their passive counterparts. In terms of, let's break it down into, you mentioned individuals. So individuals need to be educated about what an index is, why it's important to track an index, where you would track an index, the fees and the returns associated with that. That's a lot of education. You mentioned all that. Now let's talk about the employers you're talking to, because they're monitoring or overseeing 401k, 403b, and pension plans out there. Are they concerned about, are they just focusing on passive because they're concerned about some of these lawsuits that exist out there?
Well, like every throwaway answer, that's always going to depend on the organization and the employer. But with a lot of the smaller groups that I'm talking to, that is not on their mind. Frankly, they're worried about just keeping a lot of their employee benefits in general moving along and trying to get their employees into the plan and using it. So whether or not they're worried about from a fiduciary standpoint, active versus passive, I think that that's very, very similar to just individuals understanding why it's better or worse to have active versus passive. So my guess on that is that will be a more widely um, more widely asked question in a couple of years from now.
Yeah. How in those conversations that you're having with these, first, can you define smaller groups? I mean, are these under 100 employees? Are they under 1,000 employees? Are they 10,000 employee organizations?
Yeah, I'd say the vast majority of the people that I'm talking to are under 1,000 employees.
Okay, so it's still a pretty good sized group of pretty smart people probably who are the employees trying to understand their benefits. And I got to think that people do look at fees, what they can understand of the fees, because a lot of people don't understand basis points. They don't understand that's a percentage of a percentage, percentage of one, right? So 10 basis points is 0.10%, not 10%. But fees have to drive a lot of this, I would think.
And it's, in my mind, one of the most important conversations that we can be having and we should be having. So stressing education, not only to the employees, but also to the plan sponsors, because to your point, very few people understand what a basis point actually is. And it's definitely not rocket science, but it's just a matter of, let's take a little bit of time and I can coach you, walk you through what's different. Yes, passive management, here's how it's different from an actively managed investment option. But one of the key things, again, to your point, is how much it costs and how much is it costing your employees, not only this year, but then project that out 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Obviously, a very, very, very important thing.
Yeah, and it's also hard for a lot of people to find those fees. I mean, you and I both lived through the 2012 fee disclosure rules. Now you get a packet of 12 pages or more that shows you the fees and gives it in some relative terms. But if you're just going to try to figure out what the cost is to you, Mr. or Ms. participant in a retirement plan, kind of got to go through the prospectus. You got to look at the performance. It's really not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's still not easy to figure out what your costs are. And if you're in like a variable annuity or some type of annuity, you may not understand exactly at all what your costs are.
Yeah, I'm consistently surprised when I'm out talking to people that are very, very sophisticated, very well educated people, and people that have substantial assets inside of their retirement accounts or individual retirement accounts, that still do not understand how much their investments cost. And again, to your point, if they're inside some kind of an insurance product like an annuity, good luck understanding how much all that costs.
Yeah, there's that deserves its own segment. Right.
Yeah.
But let's try to stay focused on, the active versus passive and ETFs. Right now there's only one record keeper today that I can think of off the top of my head that allows ETFs. There may be one other that allows ETFs, and the architecture simply for a lot of these record keepers, these defined contribution record keepers, doesn't allow that daily trading. Or if they do it in like an SMA, a specially managed separate account. And it can be done that way, as Ryan pointed out in his segment. But do we ever get to a point that we evolve and you don't have to go out to the self-directed brokerage within a 401k or a 403b or a governmental 457 to buy that ETF, or that it is part of the architecture and something that can be considered along with an active and a passively managed mutual fund or collective investment trust?
I'd be shocked if that was not here sooner rather than later. There's lots of new financial technology, fintech companies that are coming out that'll be in the retirement planning space. And we're certainly all familiar with I don't know that I need to name individual companies out there, but you can get apps, and one of those new or rather financial tech companies that's a very popular app just added a new way to buy stock and buy shares. So that'll be here before you know it.
Yeah, and that's obviously a double-edged sword too, because people start looking at their phones not only for their text messages, but also to see what their balance is. But we'll leave that one for another day. George, I want to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want to talk to George about alternative investments. It's a segment we featured last Friday. I want to get his perspective. So George, you stay tuned, and you too stay tuned right here on BRN. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms? Especially for the smaller businesses. I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network. Welcome back. America's retirement system totals close to $30 trillion and includes lots of different retirement plans and lots of different investment options. Last week, we talked about alternative investments with Bloomberg's Tucker Piner, and he gave us a great baseline about what they are: private equity, hedge funds, infrastructure, and some of their performance. But are they appropriate for America's 401k plans? Joining me now to discuss, we're still with us, George Grombacher from the Money Alignment Academy. George, thanks so much for sticking around this morning.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. And I loved our conversation on ETFs, active versus passive. That was a big conversation last week on the program. Then on Friday, we had a great segment with Tucker Piner of Bloomberg talking about alternatives. And I asked him to define for me and the audience what alts are. And you saw the segment. He basically broke it down: hedge funds, private equity, infrastructure, distressed debt. There's like a gazillion different flavors of this thing. What were your thoughts on that segment? And just to kind of tee up my next question is, what do you think the appropriateness? Do you ever see these going into retirement plans like defined contribution plans?
Well, I thought it was full and valuable to find what alternatives are, and then to do your best to put together a list of what they are, because I think that people don't necessarily realize the scope of it or what they are and how it works, and whether or not they should be found inside of a retirement account. Well, that's a pretty important conversation.
Yeah, and so when you're talking to plan sponsors, and again, your market 1,000 employees, more or less, is this a topic that comes up in your conversations? Like, hey, we read about this in a journal. What do you think about this? Does this ever come up in your conversations among all the other things you have to cover within maybe 1 or 2 hours?
Yeah, well, it certainly does. You think about what dominates financial media. It's not necessarily good old-fashioned, pay yourself first and invest for the long term. It's what is the sparkly, shiny new thing, and oftentimes that falls into the alternative space. So if it's not the plan sponsor or somebody within the organization who is putting the plan together, it's a participant who will be asking, can I invest in real estate? Can I invest in gold? Or can I invest in crypto assets?
And what's generally, so when you're having these conversations with the employer, what do you say?
First and foremost, they say no. I think it really comes down to taking a big step back and say, okay, what do you consider your role to be? And they need to take into consideration their fiduciary responsibility when they're putting together a great retirement plan and then making investment options available. So that's a whole nother conversation. But then also, I think that they have a responsibility to, we are doing our best to put our employees in the best possible position to be successful. And this is a tool for accumulating assets for eventual retirement. So with that in mind, are alternative investments a good thing to have inside of a retirement plan? And my take on that is 99 times out of 100, they are not.
But you're talking as an individual investment. What about in a target date or a customized portfolio? You know, in a pension plan, for example, today, you may have, that's managed by trustees. They may have private equity. They may have a hedge fund. They may have distressed debt, in addition to an S&P or a indexed or actively managed funds. Do you think it's more reasonable to include that as part of a target date allocation? Because there are some funds today, target date funds today, that do offer direct real estate. I can name one or two off my head. I'm not going to, because we're not endorsing brands, but I know that they exist. So do you think that maybe they're more appropriate, less appropriate as part of the list of funds, and more appropriate baked into with an allocation in the target date fund?
Oh, certainly. That's a bit of a different conversation than the one that I was having, and that's certainly my fault. But without question, I think that things like private equity and absolute return and real assets certainly have a place inside of an investment portfolio. If you look at some of the more successful investors, they are those big endowments like Harvard and Yale, who manage billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they're not doing that just based on the S&P 500. They're taking into consideration all the different asset classes, and certainly alternatives are that. So yes, there's without question a place for a more balanced approach like that.
Yeah, but with that, to your point earlier in segment one, it's about education. So, you know, if someone is in that target date fund, because we see more and more and more participants going into the target date fund, either they're auto-enrolled and they're defaulted in there, they stay in there, they transfer their assets, or a portion of their money is in there. But it's about, you know, giving people the proper disclosure. And then on top of that, making sure that you're doing the due diligence to understand the strategy. And that's one of the points that I made to Tucker last week. I mean, you've got to understand what that strategy, you can't just be looking at the return and saying that return is 8%, but put it in, right? It's got to be, here's why it returned 8%. Here's what it did the prior 5 years. Here's what it did the prior 10 years. Here's what it's done historically. All that has to be mindful, be in the mind of the plan sponsor, the employer, but also needs to be understood by the participant.
100% true. And I think that one of the most important questions that an advisor can ask a plan sponsor or just a plan participant is, do you understand this investment? And if they can say, yes, I understand that this is what it's working on, this is what we can expect out of it, then it may very well be an appropriate investment to have inside of your retirement plan. If you can't, and to your point, you're just looking at the returns or whatever that might be, well, then that's not an appropriate investment to have inside of your lineup.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, and it's also not appropriate for someone to go out in a self-directed brokerage account within a retirement plan and start to pick and choose and whittle down and try to get some things. I mean, it just gets you. I think it gets you into trouble. To your point, you know, it just in the long run, it's really hard for any one particular individual or team to beat the market consistently. I mean, we can name names of teams that have done that, but then we can also look and say that they had a track record of 8 years or 10 years beating the S&P, and then boom, fell off a cliff.
So true. And one more thing to consider, I think, as well, which is what you're talking about, is if it's just George or if it's just Jeff who's trying to make decisions about this, about when to buy and sell, we are going against professional teams who do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And again, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be making better decisions on when to buy and sell these things. So I just am not equipped. I'm not doing the research. I don't have the resources to, I think, successfully invest in that.
Yeah, and I think you're right that over time they will find their way into separately managed accounts, target date funds, with the proper due diligence, proper understanding of the fee structures, et cetera. So I guess more to come on that. Well, George, I want to thank you for getting up early, making some time for us today. Great insight on ETFs and active and passive, and also on alternatives. We'll look forward to having you on again very soon.
Thank you.
And folks, that wraps up this week and this episode of BRN AM. Hope you enjoyed it. Hey, have a financial topic or someone of interest that you think that we should interview? Drop us a line. And don't forget, for more news in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, and more, check out today's edition of The Morning Pulse. And don't forget, tomorrow, Saturday, we've got the Weekly Pulse, a weekly wrap-up of the retirement news that matters. And on Sunday, we've got our great podcast, BRN AM. So check it all out if you have time. And until Monday, keep on saving. And don't forget, roll with the changes.
Waiting here for you to take and drink of. But if you're tired of the same